Hello everyone, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy. We have been discussing important topics for science and technology mains examination, and today we are going to discuss genetically modified crops. We will also be discussing about the gene cloning, the process of gene cloning, and nanotechnology. So these are some important topics from the science and technology, and very often the questions are also reflected from these topics. So therefore it is very important for us to discuss all these topics. And you very often heard about this genetically modified crops because they're very often in news, right? So they're very often in news, and in fact genetically modified crops are also gaining a lot of attention recent times because of the climate change, because of the government efforts to increase the incomes of the farmers, and also make sure that the existing crops are resistant to pests, and also the crops would be tolerant to droughts or tolerant to the salinity like conditions. So therefore, because keeping all these different aspects in mind, the genetically modified crops are gaining a lot of traction in recent times, right? So what are the areas where it is stressing on, those areas have been stressing on the importance of genetically modified crops? For example, food security is an area. Food security is one area where, because of the growing population and the food needs of the growing population, so it has mandated that food security is a very important domain that should focus on, and genetically modified crops can actually achieve the goal of food security. And the second goal is, the second main objective is climate change, right? So climate change is one area where it has been impacting agriculture sector as well. So we need to increase the productivity, we need to maintain the production levels, we need to increase the incomes of the farmers, and altogether we need to build a resilient agri systems. So in order to build more resilient agri systems, so the world has been increasingly looking up on the genetically modified crops. Now in genetically modified crops, the process of the genetic engineering would be used to change the genetic structure of different crops so that the desirable traits or characters can be achieved in those respective crops. Now one example of genetically modified crop is BT cotton. So BT cotton is one example of genetically modified crop, and that has helped substantially increase the productivity of cotton, and substantial increase in the productivity of cotton has resulted in India meeting its own textile needs, and also we are able to export the cotton textiles to other countries. And in fact farmers incomes are also increased because of the BT cotton. So BT cotton is one such example. So apart from that, in India there are also efforts to introduce BT brinjal and GM mustard also, right? So as of now we don't introduce any food crops which are the genetically modified crops. So as of now the approval is only given for the BT cotton. So BT cotton is the only GM crop that has been introduced on a commercial scale in India, right? So firstly we'll try to understand what exactly is GM crops, what are the benefits, what are the advantages, disadvantages of these genetically modified crops. So first let's try to understand what is a genetically modified crops. So remember, these genetically modified crops are also called as what? So they are also called as transgenic crops. Because so these genetically modified crops, the genetic structure is altered, changed or modified, either integrating or deleting specific genes, right? So even scientists or researchers will also insert new genes so that the overall structure, the character or the traits of these crop species can be altered in a desirable fashion. So that is what is called as the transgenic crops, right? Remember that every organism on this planet is consisting of a genomic material, right? So it is having its own genomic material. So therefore if we can actually alter this genomic material through the process of genetic engineering, we can actually get the crops with a desirable characteristics. So what sort of a desirable characteristics that we wanted to achieve? So the desirable characteristic include, for example, pest resistant, drought tolerant, salinity tolerant. So and those are the important traits that we can achieve through the genetically modified crops or transgenic crops, right? So what is the objective? Okay, we have altered, deleted, changed, modified the genetic structure of a particular crop or a particular plant species. Now what is the objective? So the objective is either we wanted to increase the yield, the productivity from that particular crop, and we would like to increase the nutritional value. We wanted to increase the nutritional value of that particular crop. So you might have heard about the concept called biofortification, right? So biofortification is actually a method of increasing the nutritional value of various crops. So therefore there will be no need for artificially adding nutrients, right? So biofortification is a method, and in this method crops generally have all desired nutrients, the vitamins, minerals. So they are very, very important for human beings, and in fact resistance to pests. So all these different characteristics and traits can be achieved by the genetically modified crops, right? So we have also talked about the genetically modified organisms. And in fact, genetically modified organism is any organism, any animal, any plant species. So that particular plant species or an animal species, the genetic structure is actually changed. The genetic material of that particular organism has been changed in the sense that either deleted, either new genes are added or integrated, modified or altered. So we would like to have a desired characteristics, a plant with more desired characteristics, and that is what is called as a genetically modified organism, right? So in fact in India, genetically modified organisms or genetically modified crops are also very, very often in news, right? So in this class we will be understanding what are these genetically modified crops in a very detailed manner. So what is a GM crop? We have already understood the genetically modified organisms or transgenic crops or GM crops, right? So a crop which has a gene artificially inserted. For example, imagine that a genetic material of an organism. So the genetic material of the organism and its nucleotides, and just we have either changed or artificially inserted a new gene into the existing genetic material of an organism, right? So this gene may be from another organism, this gene may be from another species. So we have just inserted another gene from another organism into this selected plant species, so that we would have appropriate and more desirable characteristics or properties from that particular selected plant. And these crops are called as genetically modified crops, and we have already understood why there is a need for the genetically modified crops. So through genetically modified crops we can actually increase the yield value, we can increase the nutritional content, and we can also produce plants which are pest resistant, and those crops which actually increase the production or the productivity, right? So if you look at the genetically modified crops in India, so BT cotton is the only cotton variety that has been introduced in India, right? So we'll try to understand some more detail, because remember that UPSC has already asked one question in prelims examination about the genetically modified crops. And in fact, when did India get its first genetically modified crop? So the first genetically modified crop variety that has been approved for the commercial cultivation in India is BT cotton, that I have already mentioned. So BT cotton is the first genetically modified cotton, first genetically modified crop variety that has been commercially introduced in India. So in fact the Bolgard 1, right? So which provided immunity against the pink bollworm, and it was developed by a company called Monsanto. And the company was given a go-ahead in the year 2002, and Monsanto has released Bollgard 2 in the year 2006. And in fact, India has become world's largest producer of cotton, partly due to this BT cotton variety, and that accounts for over 90% of the cotton acreage in the country. So this accounts for 90% of the total cotton that is cultivated in India, because of its characteristics that it actually resistant to pink bollworm that attacks the cotton crop, and it also gives yield much more, a much more higher yield than the existing conventional or traditional varieties of cotton. So because of that reason, we have introduced the genetically modified cotton variety. And in fact, so if you carefully look at the benefits of the genetically modified crop, so what are the benefits? So why countries across the world are interested in introducing the genetically modified crops? So as of now, there is a resistance against introduction of genetically modified crops because of their impact on the existing biodiversity. It is believed that they destroy biodiversity and they impact the health of the consumers or humans, and it also impact the existing ecosystem or environment as well. So because of these concerns, there is a large scale backlash against introduction of genetically modified crops, particularly food crops. So food crops are rarely allowed for the commercial cultivation in countries like India. So in fact, in India, BT brinjal and even mustard varieties are not introduced for the commercial cultivation by Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee. Now we'll one by one we'll try to understand what are the advantages of the genetically modified crops. So there is no doubt that genetically modified crops will actually increase the yield of the crop. So they substantially increase the yield of the crop because the genetically modified crops are resistant to pest. They are resistant to any diseases. They are resistant to diseases and they can effectively face the environmental stress also. Environmental stress. So they can actually withstand the environmental stress, and if any crop is able to withstand the environmental stress, so that will benefit the farmers by increasing their farming incomes. Now I would like to explain this with one example. For example, rice is heavily cultivated in the eastern part of India, particularly the coastal areas of eastern part of India. And during the harvesting season, generally what happens is that the eastern coast is vulnerable to the cyclones. So because of the cyclones, the rice which is ready for harvesting is damaged or destroyed. So if the rice varieties are able to withstand such environmental damages, so that could substantially increase the incomes of the farmers. So it is not just increasing the incomes of the farmers, so it also resulting in the food security of the people as well. So therefore, it is the advantage, it is the benefit of the genetically modified crop variety. And similarly, along with yield, so it can actually reduce the attacks on the crops by the pest attack, right? So it can actually reduces the pest attacks on the crops as well. Now understand, because of monocropping, so monocropping is mostly responsible for increased pest attack and also developing resistance by the pests. Developing resistance to by the pests to the existing pesticides is also another major reason for increasing pest attacks on the crops. So for example, how BT cotton is resistant to the pink bollworm pink bollworm attack, in a similar way the genetically modified crops are also resistant to the various pest attacks. So thereby farmers, there is no need to use the pesticide or insecticide, so it could actually substantially reduce the input costs of the farmers, right? So it helps in reducing the input costs of the farmers, and thereby it could also result in minimizing overall environmental impact. So how? Because increased use of insecticides, increased use of pesticides would result in soil pollution. It would result in the pollution of water, and in fact it also impact health of humans as well, and it destroy the existing biodiversity, because these pesticides and insecticides are also harmful to the beneficial microorganisms. So therefore this is another major advantage of the genetically modified crops. And apart from that, the genetically modified crops can also substantially increase nutritional value, right? So nutritional value is also another very important dimension one should actually look into, because as of now in India, around 2/3 of women are suffering with the iron deficiency, and in fact we are also a country with a huge number of people with malnourishment, undernourishment, or child mortality rates, infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rates, and stunting, wasting. So all these problems are being faced. So therefore the solution is either fortification or biofortification of food. So that can actually address the problem of malnutrition in India, right? So the genetically modified crops can be produced with the highest nutritional value, and that will be helpful in reducing the problem of malnourishment or malnutrition in India, right? So we have programs like Poshan Bharat, programs like Poshan Bharat. So therefore, if we wanted to deal with the problem of malnutrition, it is very important that we need to produce crops with a higher nutritional content or higher nutritional value. And in fact, we can also improve the crop quality as well, right? So we can actually produce better quality crops. For example, the shelf life of fruits can be substantially increased, right? And in fact, whatever we have produced, the taste of such produce can also be increased at a manifold. So thereby it actually benefit not just farmers by increasing their incomes, rather it also benefits the consumers as well. So this is another major advantage. Now the global threat that we have been facing as of now is climate change. So climate change is a global threat that we have been facing. So how we can address this climate change? And in fact, climate change is impacting the agriculture across the globe. So increasing sea levels and storm surges, and in fact submergence of the coastal plains with the saline water, or so increasing soil salinity. So therefore all these are the major threats which are associated with the climate change. However, the genetically modified crop varieties can be engineered in a better manner, so therefore they can actually withstand the negative impact of the climate change. So thereby we can actually build resilient crop varieties. They can withstand the negative impact of the climate change. And in fact, so people across the world have also consumed these products genetically modified over last 20 years without any health issues as well. And because of this particular reason, the genetically modified crops are further promoted or encouraged across the globe. However, it is associated with certain risks. So we have just discussed that the genetically modified crops are also facing a huge resistance across the globe because of various reasons. Now, what are the reasons, or what are the risks or the disadvantages which are associated with these genetically modified crops? In fact, they can have allergic reactions. So once you consume a food which is produced from the genetically modified crops, you may experience the allergic reactions, because these genetically modified crops would actually consist of certain proteins, and these proteins would cause allergic reactions among the people. So therefore, we can actually say that they are not without the negative health impact. So they impact the health of the human beings. So therefore, we should be very careful when it comes to consuming food from the genetically modified crops. And apart from that, gene transfer. So genetically modified crops actually involves transfer of genes from one organism to another organism to achieve the desired traits or desired characteristics. So therefore, there is a risk that genes from genetically modified crops, so they might be transferred to wild plants, wild animals. So thereby, it would result in creation of new pests and also new diseases, and that would ultimately destroy or damage the existing biodiversity. Right? So it would ultimately destroy or damage the existing biodiversity. So therefore, this could be another major challenge we will face because of the introduction of the genetically modified crops. As of now, biodiversity has been facing various challenges. For example, climate change is one challenge, global warming is another challenge, forest fires is another challenge, and deforestation is also a challenge, and increasing the anthropogenic or increasing human activities, and that are also threatening the existing biodiversity as well, and increasing invasive alien species. So all these are various challenges that have been threatening the existing biodiversity. It is also expected that the introduction of the genetically modified crops on a large scale will also affect the biodiversity, will also negatively impact the existing biodiversity. However, there are certain ethical concerns, and those ethical concerns should be kept in mind here as well, because it is not natural. We have been artificially inserting certain genes from other organism into a selected plant species or animal species. So therefore, it also comes with certain ethical concerns as well, because the genetically modified food is also called as the designer food. In research labs, the genes are being transferred from one plant species to another plant species. So therefore, the food that we consume from the genetically modified crops is called as the designer food. So it is being called as designer food to increase the corporate control of the food supply. So it actually increase the corporate control of the food supply as well. So it would certainly impact the developing countries and underdeveloped countries like India. So India is a developed country, so a developing country, and underdeveloped countries in Africa, they are also impacted by such a large scale control of food supply by the corporates. It also creates problems like food security issues will also be created. Food security issues will also be created. And similarly, there are some unknown impacts as well. So what unknown impacts that we have? So one unknown impact is on human health, because we have as of now not fully understood the negative impact of the genetically modified crops on human health. So we have not fully understood. So it actually requires a lot of research to exactly what are the harmful effects of consuming genetically modified foods on human health. So therefore it is having impact on environment, it is having impact on the soil, and it also impact the entire food chain as well. So thereby it is having impact on the environment, the ecosystem, and also the biodiversity of a particular area. And similarly, the social and economic issues, right? So it is also having the social and economic issues, such as activists are concerned that the multinational agribusinesses companies, they actually start controlling farming and displacing small farmers, and they also create dependency on GM seed companies. And market acceptance is also another major issue, because there are concerns regarding acceptance of GM food in the market, right? So these are actually the potential conflicts that are being associated with, or the potential risks or the disadvantages that are associated with the genetically modified crops. So remember, whenever you get the answer on genetically modified crops, so it is very important for you to mention both advantages and disadvantages of genetically modified crops, right? So in fact, so with respect to genetically modified crops, there are some concerns are also that are being associated, because mutations and the natural selection are the predominant evolutionary mechanisms to induce variations in plants, right? So either mutations in the genes or the genetic structure of a particular organism should take place, or the other way is natural selection. So these are the two methods which actually induce, or they are actually the predominant evolutionary mechanisms, and they are primarily induce variations among the plant species. But here what we are doing, we are artificially altering, changing, modifying the genetic structure of the plant species, and that would certainly have an impact on the environment. And in fact, in recombinant DNA technology, all the molecular and cellular events which are triggered with the insertion of exogenous DNA, and it is not precisely understood. And in fact, the other negative aspect which is associated with the genetically modified seeds is that high input cost. So high seed cost, we actually mention this high seed cost. And in fact, the companies which are producing the genetically modified seeds, they actually produce the seeds with the terminating technology. So terminating technology is essentially a technology where the seeds would be used only once. So you cannot derive seeds from the existing GM crop, and you can cultivate those seeds in the next season. So that is what is called as terminating technology. Thereby these private companies just forcing farmers to buy seeds from these corporate companies. So don't you think that this would certainly increase the dependence of the farmers on the corporates, and it would also increase the seed cost or overall the input cost as well? And the problem here is that small farmers are not able to withstand the crop losses. So in case of the failure of the crop, or in case of the crop losses because of any other reason, because of drought-like conditions or floods, so small farmers, because of the higher seed cost, they cannot withstand the crop failures or crop losses. So that is also another major problem that is associated with the genetically modified crops. And in fact, the site of genes insertion is not controllable, and health concerns from unintended effects have been raised by different research agencies, right? So therefore, this is also another major problem. And in fact, in India, BT cotton, failed to live up to the promise in 10 years, because after a certain extent the yield started stagnating, right? So the yield in BT cotton started stagnating, and after that the yield of the cotton crop has not increased substantially. And in fact, the pest is also started developing resistance to the BT cotton, the toxins that it actually produce. So therefore, this is also another major drawback that is associated with the genetically modified crops. And farmers would also face a huge socio-economic cost as well, because of the seeds that they have to purchase. And BT cotton farmers were also asked to revert to the traditional pest management, and therefore it displays the failure of Boligar to cotton. And in fact, if you look at the total cotton production in India, so 95% of the cotton that we produce in India is the genetically modified cotton variety. So it actually occupies greater than 95% of India's total cotton acreage. And in fact, the cotton yield has also started stagnating around 500 kg per hectare. So this is still lower than countries like Egypt and also China. So therefore, this indicates the failure of the genetically modified crops. It also indicates that these GM crops have certain limitations. And in fact, in India, as of now, no genetically modified food crop has been introduced for the commercial cultivation. So BT brinjal, so this is also a genetically modified variant of brinjal, was cleared by the genetic engineering appraisal committee. It has to give approval for the cultivation of any or introduction of genetically modified crops. Even though it has approved cultivation of BT brinjal, the UPA government, the previous UPA government, has actually put a moratorium on cultivation of BT brinjal on a large scale. And the mustard variety, which is also known as DMH11, so that was developed by Delhi University, and it was also cleared by the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, but later this approval has been withdrawn by the same Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee. Right? So therefore, these are the benefits, these are the advantages, disadvantages that are associated with the genetically modified crop or plant species. Right? So in fact, you need to write an appropriate way forward about the genetically modified crops, because genetically modified crops are associated with various benefits. They have been benefiting the consumers, they have been benefiting the farmers, and they are also reducing the input cost, and they are also substantially increasing the productivity and production. And in fact, there are also concerns which are associated, but we have to focus on more research and development to understand what are the negative impacts of the genetically modified crops on the environment, on the human health. Right? So that is actually key, so that we can actually introduce these GM crops on large scale, so that will help meet food security, that will help increase incomes of the farmers. Right? So it has a lot of benefits. Right? So therefore, a careful assessment, a balanced approach is required. So next, a very important topic is cloning. So we'll try to understand what is cloning. So what is the meaning of cloning and how it is done, and what are the benefits or the advantages of the cloning process. Right? So cloning is also very, very important method, which is also very often in news, and there are also questions about the cloning in prelims examination as well as mains examination as well. Right? So cloning is actually a scientific process, and this involves creation of a genetically identical copies of living organisms or cells. Right? So clone means that, for example, imagine that there is an individual, a similar individual like individual A can be created with a same features, with same characteristics. Right? So that is what is called as cloning. Right? So we'll understand how cloning is done. and what are the benefits or what are the advantages of the cloning process. So still it is in the developmental phase, right? So however, there is a strict regulation on the cloning method, right? So we'll also understand why there is a strict regulation, a control over cloning, right? Because this process of cloning has actually generated a lot of enthusiasm among researchers, governments, and also the medical professionals across the world. And it is also, it also involves a lot of controversies as well, right? Because the cloning's applications ranging from medical advancements to the conservation of the endangered species. So medical advancements are very, very important as of now for the humanity. And at the same time, because of a lot of reasons, species are also getting extinct, right? So we can also produce those endangered species on a large scale. Imagine that the great Indian bustard. Great Indian bustard. So the great Indian bustard is also a critically endangered species of IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. So this process of cloning can be used for the conservation or the protection of the great Indian bustard. So we'll understand how the process of cloning is actually takes place through this image. Imagine that there is a black sheep species called Polly. So Polly is having a black face, and another sheep species Molly, it is having a white face, right? So Molly is having the white face and Polly is having the black face. Now how cloning is being done, right? So how cloning is being done so that to Polly a white faced sheep can be born. Now what we actually do, we separate genetic material from empty egg of Polly. So we actually collect an egg. So we collect egg from Polly, and similarly we also collect an egg from Molly, right? So this is the egg that is being collected from the Molly, and this is the egg that has been collected from Polly. Now in Polly's egg, what we do, we just remove the nucleus. So this is nucleus, we remove the nucleus. So therefore there is an egg, this is an empty egg without the nucleus. And in Molly's egg, we remove the nucleus. Now this nucleus will be added with the egg of Polly, right? So the nucleus that has been removed from the egg of Molly will be added into the empty egg of Polly, right? So now we have an egg with the nucleus. So here the egg belong to Polly and nucleus belong to Molly, right? So this is called as Polly's egg with Molly's nucleus. And now this egg is planted in a surrogate mother that is called as Holy. So in Holy, it acts as a surrogate mother. In Holy, we introduced this engineered or genetically modified or this engineered egg into Holy. So this is also called as the surrogate mother, and it is having a black face. Now the ultimate result is a white faced sheep Dolly is born to this black faced sheep Holy. The sheep is black faced, but ultimately we have actually produced a white faced sheep to a black faced sheep. So this is how cloning is being done. So I hope you have understood how cloning is being done. So however, cloning is being done or it is actually done in different types or different methods. So this involves not just a one single method of cloning. So there are different methods of cloning. So what are those different methods of cloning? So the first method is the somatic cell nuclear transfer method, right? So this method is called as somatic cell nuclear transfer method, and this method is called as the most common method of cloning. right? So this is most common method, so most commonly used method of cloning. So in this method, the nucleus of the somatic cell is transferred into the egg cell, and that has had its nucleus removed. So like how we have understood in the previous diagram, the previous image, so that is what is called as the somatic cell transfer method of cloning, right? So there are two different organisms, organism A and organism B, and we have collected an egg from the organism A, and we also collected an egg from organism B, and here nucleus is being removed, right? So there will be an empty egg without nucleus, and here nucleus will be removed. So nucleus from egg B will be added to the egg of A, right? So and this will be introduced in a surrogate mother C, right? So ultimately it will result in cloning or a new organism with desired characteristics, and that is what is called as the somatic cell nuclear transfer method, right? And in fact the egg cell is then simulated to divide, and then it results in embryo is implanted into the surrogate mother, right? So it will be introduced into a surrogate mother, and that's how cloning process is being done. So the second method is also called as the embryonic stem cell cloning. So embryonic stem cell cloning is the second method. So this method involves creating embryos from the stem cells. So there are stem cells within the body of a human being. So there are different areas where the stem cells can be produced, or stem cells can be reaped. So the advantage of these stem cells is that they can actually divide themselves, they can actually multiply themselves, and from the stem cells we can actually create a whole new body part, or so that's the advantage, or that's the benefit of these stem cells. So this method actually involves creating embryos. We can actually produce a lot of embryos, right? So we can produce embryos from these stem cells, and the embryonic stem cells are taken from the embryos that have been created in a laboratory. So imagine that an embryo has been created in a laboratory, and from that embryo we derived the embryonic stem cells. We have derived embryonic stem cells, and then the embryos that are divided into smaller group of cells. So this embryo would be divided into the smaller group of cells, and each group would be implanted into the surrogate mother, right? So it will be introduced into the surrogate mother, right? So this is the second method of cloning. The third method of cloning is also known as gene cloning, right? So this method actually involves the cloning of the genetic material of a particular organism, or this involves cloning of genes. And in fact genes are also considered as instructions for making proteins, right? So they issue instructions for making proteins in human body. And in fact gene cloning can be used to create new proteins or modify the existing proteins. So these are the three methods of the cloning that actually takes place, but the most common method of cloning is somatic cell nuclear transfer. And in fact embryonic stem cell cloning and gene cloning are also other types of cloning. And now we'll try to understand what are the benefits, or what are the advantages of, or potential applications of cloning, because we just discussed that cloning has a lot of applications. So it has its applications in the field of agriculture, because the cloning as a method can be used to create crops, and those crops which could be resistant to the pests, like how the genetically modified crops that we can produce, and those crops are resistant to the pests, those crops are resistant to the diseases. In a similar way, in cloning also we can actually produce crops, they can be resistant to various pests, they can actually withstand various pests and diseases, and they can also various herbicides, or it will also result in increased crop yield as well. Increased crop yield and reduced food prices, right? So reduced food prices, because if there is a lesser losses, less crop losses or less crop failures, so that increases the supply of the food into the market. So supply of food into the market would over a period of time result in reducing the prices of various food crops, and that also makes food accessible for everybody. So thereby it results in what? It results in food security for the people, right? So it will result in food security for the people. And in fact, medicine, right? So it is also having important applications in the arena of medicine as well, right? Because a cloning as a method can actually be used to create organs, right? So we can actually create organs, we can also create tissues, and whatever organs or whatever tissues that we have already created through a method called cloning, so they can be used for the transplantation. And in fact, there is a huge demand for the organs and also tissues. So therefore these organs and tissues can be used for the transplantation, and that actually reduce the shortage of organs and also the tissues for the transplantation. Remember, I told you that there is a huge demand for the transplantation, right? So apart from that, it can also be used in reproductive cloning. So reproductive cloning, particularly for the conservation purposes. So remember that a lot of animal species are being endangered, so they are threatened, and most of the species are either critically endangered or endangered, and conservation is very, very important to sustainably protect the biodiversity. So therefore cloning has a huge role to play here, because this method of cloning can be used for conservation of various animals, and we can also preserve the endangered species which have been facing the threat of extinction. Thereby we can actually produce the genetically identical individuals. And similarly, the biomedical research is another very, very important area where we can actually see the potential applications of the cloning, because we can actually generate animal models with a specific genetic trait or with a specific genetic characteristic, right? And they help us study new diseases and also develop new treatments for such diseases. So therefore it would actually revolutionize the entire medicine. And even organ transplantation is also another very important area. Well, we have already understood, because the cloning as a method can actually be used for creating organs. We can also create tissues, and those organs and tissues can be used for the transplantation. And as of now, there is a shortage of donor organs, and this shortage can be effectively met. And even livestock improvement is also another very important and potential application of the cloning method, because we can actually produce genetically superior livestock for increased productivity, disease resistance, and also improved food production as well. So we can say that it would result in food security, it would increases the yield of the various crops, and it would also result in the biofortification of the food as well. So these are the applications, the wide variety applications that we have with the method called cloning. And we can actually revive the extinct species as well, right? So if we have a DNA and that DNA is preserved and that DNA belong to the already extinct species, so we can actually revive those extinct species with the available DNA, right? So however, this application is still hypothetical, and it is also considered as ethically very, very complex. However, still there are a lot of ethical concerns that are being associated with the method cloning. So what are the ethical concerns that we must take into concern when we go ahead with the methods called cloning? So there is a huge potential for abuse, right? So there is a potential for abuse such a method, because cloning has a lot of applications. Because cloning can even be used for creating clones of people without their own consent, and this is considered as an unethical purpose, right? For example, creating clones for military or commercial use, so that would be destructive, right? So therefore, this is the first ethical concern that is associated with the cloning, the method of cloning. And even there is also a potential for harm to clones, because clones may be at an increased risk of health problems, because we don't know, we have not conducted adequate research on clones and how the conditions would be once they started growing up. So therefore, there is an increased risk of health problems being faced by these cloned individuals, because the clones that we have created, they are genetically identical, genetically similar, and any genetic defect in the original organism could actually be passed on to the clones as well, right? So therefore, potential harm caused to the clones is also another major problem that is associated here. And in fact, the potential for devaluing human life, because the future society may not value the cloned individuals as how a natural individual would be valued. So therefore, it could lead to the devaluation of human life. So you are devaluing a human life by creating a clone. And if clones are seen as less than human, and it could lead to discrimination and also the abuse of the cloned individuals. It will also result in loss of individuality, because the cloning actually raises the concerns about the loss of individuality and the uniqueness of an individual. Thereby, they may be perceived as a mere replicas rather than distinct individuals, and it may lead to the exploitation of such individuals. It may lead to the discrimination and even abuse of those individuals, and ultimately it leads to violation of basic human rights. And in fact, there are a lot of health risks also that are associated with this, right? Because cloning can result in various health issues, including genetic abnormalities among the human beings or cloned individuals, mutations, and compromised immune systems. So all these things would actually ultimately impact the overall well-being of clones. However, there is a need for a large-scale research and development to fully understand the consequences of cloning. And there is also a need for the global collaboration on this front. And apart from that, there is also need for the global regulation as well. Global collaboration, global regulation, and there is a need to emphasize more on research and development at the national level. And we need to understand the benefits of cloning, and we need to apply the benefits or positives of cloning in various sectors such as agriculture, such as livestock management, and biodiversity conservation, biodiversity protection. So in all these areas, we need to increasingly use cloning if it benefits the environment, if it benefits the ecology, if it results in further strengthening the biodiversity, right? So anyway, that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. So if you like our lecture, please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.